Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPad 6th generation and see if this particular iPad is still worth buying in 2024. Now, this iPad is a very, very interesting iPad to say the least, because a lot of different things have happened with this iPad throughout the last couple of years. And although this may not be the first iPad I would recommend a vast majority of people to go ahead and buy, this is still a very interesting iPad to say the least. And if you do want to pick up some iPads that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPad 6th generation, you can see on the front of this iPad, we basically have a 9.7-inch Retina IPS panel on the front of it. It's an IPS LCD panel, and the resolution of these iPads was actually fairly large. You're getting 1536 by 2048. That is a fairly large amount of, that's a fairly big resolution, and that's actually a very good thing going on. If you're buying an iPad like this, you're actually getting an iPad that still has a lot of, has a high resolution. That's a really nice thing going on for these particular iPads. And that was by far one of my most favorite things going on for these types of devices, was that you can just buy this iPad and still have a very, very good display. Now, around this iPad, it's a little bit of a different story. There's quite a bit of bezel around this particular device. So it's pretty thick. Even on the sides of this iPad, there are pretty thick bezels, and that's just kind of what happened here. It's totally okay, it's totally what's expected, but just keep in mind it's a pretty thick amount of bezel here. You're getting the Touch ID sensor on the front as well, which is cool. It's nice having Touch ID, and like I said, I'm a fan of it. So that's something that's pretty cool going on here as well. You can just click on that, home button and then just kind of move around and run around with it, which is really cool. It's a good little iPad from that perspective. So I think from that side, it definitely gets a thumbs up for me, but it is a pretty old looking iPad. The only reason I even say it gets a thumbs up for me is because it is a, 2018 iPad. When you look at it from that lens, you're like, oh, okay, like it actually really isn't that bad. But when you start thinking about it like, oh, this thing is, clearly a much older looking iPad than even like an iPad 9th generation, this thing definitely does start kind of showing its age. And that's just kind of what happens when you're getting these types of iPads. So kind of keep that in mind. It's not the end of the world or anything, but it is one of those small things to kind of keep in mind there. So on the front side, that kind of covers it up. On the bottom side, you are getting that, lightning port, which is still nice. Having lightning on these types of iPads is still very good. And I don't really have too much to complain about. If I'm getting a lightning port on an iPad, I'm still perfectly, completely fine with that. You're also getting a headphone jack on this iPad as well. That's like another nice thing. I still think these iPads look very, very good. And for the most part, if I'm getting an iPad, like I said before, I'm not really going to complain about it too much. And I think for these types of iPads, for these types of displays, they still look very, very good for the most part as well. Now on the back side, you're getting a full-on aluminum back, which still looks very good. And that's the thing about these iPads. They just look good pretty much every single way. Even though this thing is like 6 years old, it still looks perfectly fine for the most part. You're getting a single camera setup on the top left corner. And overall, like I said before, I'm a fan of it. I'm a fan of the way this particular camera looks. I'm a fan of the way this, iPad looks on the backside. It is missing some things that a lot of iPads nowadays do have. It's missing things like USB Type-C. You are not getting USB-C on this iPad. You're really not getting too many other cool features like ProMotion or anything that we have in some newer iPads either. So once again, it's somewhat of a limited version of a device, but I still think it's good enough, and I'm not really complaining too much about this particular device from that perspective. So from that side, it kind of gets a thumbs up for me, just the way it looks for like a 6-year-old iPad almost. A few things to keep in mind too, this thing does have Apple Pencil 1 support, so you can easily plug in the Apple Pencil 1 on the bottom of this iPad and still get a very good feeling performing iPad with that Apple Pencil, which is another really cool thing. And I don't think this was the first iPad that supported Apple Pencil, but it was still a really nice one that we had on this particular device. So to kind of sum it up on the outside, definitely gets a thumbs up for me for how old this iPad is. In terms of the camera side, like I mentioned, you are basically getting a single 8 megapixel camera on the back side of this thing, which can be, it's not the best camera of all time. You're also getting a 1.2 megapixel camera on the front or on the back side on the front camera as well. And the thing with this camera is it's pretty much like an iPhone 5S or an iPhone 6 camera on this device. It's a pretty outdated looking camera, and that's, again, kind of what happens when you're getting these types of devices. These cameras and these devices just don't really look that great anymore, and that is kind of an unfortunate reality. So if you're buying this type of device, just keep in mind you're definitely getting a phone that doesn't really look or getting an iPad that doesn't look as great anymore, which is kind of expected. So again, I would hate to recommend a phone to people, or an iPad to people if it's already going to be outdated. And this type of camera is severely outdated when it comes down to it. So like I said, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm recommending these types of iPads if nobody's really wanting to buy them or nobody's going to want to use them. And I would kind of say at a high level, that's kind of what's going on for the most part. So just keep that in mind. It's not the end of the world or anything, but it is just one of those things to kind of keep in mind in the back of your head. So that kind of sums it up from that specific perspective as well. Now, in terms of software and longevity, this is kind of a more complicated thing going going on for this particular device. So this iPad was supported for quite a bit of time, and it's still supported with iPadOS. So you are still able to install iPadOS 17 on this particular iPad. And this is where things get very interesting, because this type of iPad, although it is kind of outdated, in terms of hardware, it's a 6-year-old iPad right now, this type of iPad is still kind of getting software support. So you would never think that an iPad of this caliber at this day and age is still kind of even somewhat supported, but that's kind of what's going on. That's kind of the cool thing about these iPads too, is that you can still buy an iPad from so many years ago and still have a pretty decent experience of these iPads from these types of devices. So that was something I actually liked a lot about this device. And if I were to go ahead and buy an iPad, I would want to make sure without a doubt I'm buying an iPad that is still supported with software that still has a future ahead of it. If I'm buying an iPad and it's already outdated, that's going to be a pretty big problem. So I, would recommend buying an iPad that's supported. And this is basically one of the oldest iPads that is currently supported as of this point. So I would recommend it. If you're going to buy an iPad, buy one that's supported. Would I buy this one? I don't know if I would necessarily buy this one per se, but the fact that it is supported helps its case out a little bit. So from that perspective, that's kind of one thing to kind of keep in mind there as well. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this particular iPad is giving you that Apple A10 Fusion chip inside of it with 2 GB of RAM. Now the funny thing is with this particular iPad, this iPad basically has the same chipset as like the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus. That's actually pretty insane. And the fact that this iPad is still supported, but like iPads or iPhones like the iPhone 10 are not, supported, is actually pretty insane to me. I feel like this iPad is still a very, very decent performing iPad for how old it is. You would never imagine that this type of iPad can still kind of push the boundaries and push what it does at this point. But like I said, I wouldn't recommend buying this iPad really for anything. But the fact that it is still kind of supported with software is a very interesting thing. And that's a very cool thing going on for this type of device, that you can basically buy it and still have a pretty good performing iPad for how old it is. But that's a two-part story. It's a good performing iPad for how old it is, but it is not a good performing iPad that I would recommend the average person to buy. Like it's decent, it's good, it gets the job done. But if you're trying to go in and play intensive games or intensive applications or do things from that perspective, I feel like you're definitely going to run into some issues. You're going to run into problems where randomly this particular device is just not going to be able to handle, some things you throw at it. It's not the end of the world or anything, but once again, that's one of those small things to kind of keep in mind. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I would definitely tell you is, I definitely would tell you that a device like the iPad 6th generation, it wouldn't necessarily be the first device I would recommend to people. Although it's a, older iPad and I love recommending older iPads to people, I don't think this is the one I'd recommend because it's already kind of outdated in a lot of different ways. You are much better off buying probably something like the, iPad 7 or 8th generation. Those things are going to be better. I think the iPad 9th generation is definitely a way better device than all these other iPads. And that's probably the one I'd recommend a majority of people to buy from that perspective as of this point. So from that kind of covers it up here. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.